Well, if anything happens, I shall be at Katavasov's. No, nothing will happen, and don't think about it. I'm going for a walk on the boulevard with Papa. We're going to see Dolly. I shall expect you before dinner. Oh, yes. Do you know that Dolly's position is becoming utterly impossible? She's in debt all round, she hasn't a penny. We were talking yesterday with Mama and Arseny, this was her sister's husband Lvov, and we determined to send you with him to talk to Stiva. It's really unbearable. One can't speak to Papa about it. But if you and he... Why, what can we do? Said Levin. You'll be at Arseny's, anyway, talk to him, he will tell what we decided. Oh, I agree to everything Arseny thinks beforehand. I'll go and see him. By the way, if I do go to the concert, I'll go with Natalia. Well, goodbye. On the steps Levin was stopped by his old servant Kuzma, who had been with him before his marriage, and now looked after their household in town. Beauty, that was the left shaft horse brought up from the country, has been badly shod and is quite lame, he said. What does your honor wish to be done? During the first part of their stay in Moscow, Levin had used his own horses brought up from the country. He had tried to arrange this part of their expenses in the best and cheapest way possible, but it appeared that their own horses came dearer than hired horses, and they still hired too. Send for the veterinary, there may be a bruise. And for Katerina Alexandrovna? Asked Kuzma. Levin was not by now struck as he had been at first by the fact that to get from one end of Moscow to the other he had to have two powerful horses put into a heavy carriage, to take the carriage 3 miles through the snowy slush and to keep it standing there 4 hours, paying 5 rubles every time. Now it seemed quite natural. Hire a pair for our carriage from the jobmaster, said he. Yes, sir. And so, simply and easily, thanks to the facilities of town life, Levin settled a question which, in the country, would have called for so much personal trouble and exertion, and going out onto the steps, he called a sledge, sat down, and drove to Nikitsky. On the way he thought no more of money, but mused on the introduction that awaited him to the Petersburg savant, a writer on sociology, and what he would say to him about his book. Only during the first days of his stay in Moscow Levin had been struck by the expenditure, strange to one living in the country, unproductive but inevitable, that was expected of him on every side. But by now he had grown used to it. That had happened to him in this matter which is said to happen to drunkards: the first glass sticks in the throat, the second flies down like a hawk, but after the third they're like tiny little birds. When Levin had changed his first 100-ruble note to pay for liveries for his footman and hall porter, he could not help reflecting that these liveries were of no use to anyone, but they were indubitably necessary, to judge by the amazement of the princess and Kitty when he suggested that they might do without liveries, that these liveries would cost the wages of 2 laborers for the summer, that is, would pay for about 300 working days from Easter to Ash Wednesday, and each a day of hard work from early morning to late evening, and that 100-ruble note did stick in his throat. But the next note, changed to pay for providing a dinner for their relations, that cost 28 rubles, though it did excite in Levin the reflection that 28 rubles meant 9 measures of oats, which men would with groans and sweat have reaped and bound and thrashed and winnowed and sifted and sown. This next one he parted with more easily. And now the notes he changed no longer aroused such reflections, and they flew off like little birds. Whether the labor devoted to obtaining the money corresponded to the pleasure given by what was bought with it, was a consideration he had long ago dismissed. His business calculation that there was a certain price below which he could not sell certain grain was forgotten too. The rye, for the price of which he had so long held out, had been sold for 50 kopecks a measure cheaper than it had been fetching a month ago. Even the consideration that with such an expenditure he could not go on living for a year without debt, that even had no force. Only one thing was essential: to have money in the bank, without inquiring where it came from, so as to know that one had the wherewithal to buy meat for tomorrow. And this condition had hitherto been fulfilled. He had always had the money in the bank. But now the money in the bank had gone, and he could not quite tell where to get the next installment. And this it was which, at the moment when Kitty had mentioned money, had disturbed him, but he had no time to think about it. He drove off, thinking of Katavasov and the meeting with Metrov that was before him. Chapter 3. Levin had on this visit to town seen a great deal of his old friend at the university, Professor Katavasov, whom he had not seen since his marriage. He liked in Katavasov the clearness and simplicity of his conception of life. Levin thought that the clearness of Katavasov's conception of life was due to the poverty of his nature. Katavasov thought that the disconnectedness of Levin's ideas was due to his lack of intellectual discipline, but Levin enjoyed Katavasov's clearness, and Katavasov enjoyed the abundance of Levin's untrained ideas, and they liked to meet and to discuss. Levin had read Katavasov some parts of his book, and he had liked them. On the previous day Katavasov had met Levin at a public lecture and told him that the celebrated Metrov, whose article Levin had so much liked, was in Moscow, that he had been much interested by what Katavasov had told him about Levin's work, and that he was coming to see him tomorrow at 11, and would be very glad to make Levin's acquaintance. "You're positively a reformed character, I'm glad to see," said Katavasov, meeting Levin in the little drawing room. "I heard the bell and thought, impossible that it can be he at the exact time." "Well, what do you say to the Montenegrins now? They're a race of warriors." "Why, what's happened?" asked Levin. Katavasov in a few words told him the last piece of news from the war, and going into his study, introduced Levin to a short, thick-set man of pleasant appearance. This was Metrov. The conversation touched for a brief space on politics and on how recent events were looked at in the higher spheres in Petersburg. Metrov repeated a saying that had reached him through a most trustworthy source, reported as having been uttered on this subject by the Tsar and one of the ministers. Katavasov had heard also on excellent authority that the Tsar had said something quite different.